Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Ridiculously Goodreads book club. This is the everyone's scattered even farther than usual edition of our conversation. I'm Damon Jensen Heitman. I'm one of the pastors of First Presbyterian Church, Hastings, Nebraska, and we have been reading our way through Lila by Marilynne Robinson. I have my copy right here, part of the Gilead-verse, Marilynne Robinson-verse. We've read a couple of other stories set with these same characters in the same universe, world. And I am joined in discussion by who would like to start? Constance, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Constance Malloy. I'm a retired English professor from Hastings College. I've also taught at the community college in Hastings, and I'm enjoying this series.
Yeah. And you're traveling right now. And
yes, I'm in California staying with my 97-year-old aunt who could knock us all down and whip us all out intellectually.
And you've rearranged, or maybe not rearranged, but arranged your schedule a special to find reliable internet to be able to join us. So thank you for that, Constance. And Jenny is here as well. Hello, Jenny.
Hi, I'm Jenny Welsh, current English instructor. I teach online for Bellevue University and CCC here in Hastings, but I don't often get to teach lit classes, so this is always a joy for me to get to do this deep dive into literature with you all. I don't know if it's because it's the third book or if Lila's narration and inner workings are different. This read is a lot easier for me than the other two. I feel like I'm reading this one faster and I'm not getting as lost in it. So I don't know if I'm just that in it on book 3 or if this is somehow an easier read. I don't know. Does anyone else agree, disagree?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have fewer characters on stage.
Oh, okay, that's true. Not as many of the Bowden family as we did in the last.
They're just kind of in the background.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all her narration. Not that it wasn't all glories in the last one, but yeah.
Yeah, but even there are fewer mysteries, I think, to guess at.
That's true.
In some ways, in Home, we spent a lot of time guessing at the mysteries of Glory,
mm-hmm.
and of Jack, and of Reverend Bowden, and which I've also, Jenny, I've been finding that I'm reading through it more quickly than I did the other books. And maybe that's part of the reason why.
Well, I think too, it's becoming very familiar at this point with Robinson's writing style and the fact that all 3 books are consistent and that you don't get chapters. And this one, actually, I think we've maybe talked about this, or maybe you and I talked about this, Damon, how it's the timeline in this book is so confusing in the sense of you're shifting forward, backward, all over the place, sometimes, like you said, within the same paragraph. And so in that sense, it's not any more transparent than the other books, but I think we've had enough exposure to her style here that it just starts to feel like, oh, I'm just on this ride where we could jump any direction at any point in terms of, especially with Lila, I feel like there's a lot of the back and forth and present, past, whatever.
Yeah. When she goes into the past, as she does frequently, we just get a little more each time filled in to understand where she's come from.
Yeah, the more I think time that we spend with these books and with this writing style, really the more that and I appreciated this in the past, but the more that I appreciate the way that this writing style, I think, really closely reflects or mirrors the way that folks tend to kind of slowly reveal themselves to one another. We don't just dump all of our stuff on the table the first time that we meet somebody, and we might not really fully do it over the course of 60, 70 years. There's just always something about somebody else that's just always a little bit of a mystery. And I really feel that these characters are that same way. For as much time as we've spent with Reverend Ames, there's still stuff that just kind of, what is that about? Why is he doing that? So, which kind of draws to mind, Jenny, something that you have really been noticing from this section in particular.
Yes, which is Ames's laughter. I know we paid a lot of attention to laughter in the second book. Can't really remember what the first, but with the second book, we looked at Jack and his laughter, because it was never, maybe not never, but rarely was it like joyful, pure, childlike laughter. It was always very layered, derisive, ironic, just different. And I feel like with Ames, I don't remember him being a laughing character in the other two books either, for that matter. But again, the first one's from his perspective. The second one is Glory's, so that's a little different. But in here, he laughs. And I don't know, I have it taken kind of two different ways, maybe, where maybe Ames is a more lighthearted person than I thought. And also, I think, and this is something you talked about, Damon, or that I know you want to talk about, Lila seems offended by his laughter a lot. Like, I just get the sense that she's like, why is that funny? Or like, I don't know. It seems that it's also layered laughter.
Yeah. Go ahead, Constance.
I think Lila is taken aback by that and offended, partly because she knows that she's ignorant. She's not unintelligent at all, but she's unschooled in so many ways that she feels he probably ought to not value her. But one of the things that I think is so superb about this relationship is she brings these naive questions to Ames that nobody else would ask him.
True.
They're the real mysteries, like a child would ask.
And it does seem at times like he is laughing sometimes in surprise, as in delight, like, oh wow, I guess I hadn't thought of that kind of laughter. But yes, she's so sensitive to it, and I think her upbringing is a very good connection to think about there.
Yeah, it seems to me a lot of times his laughter comes from a question that Lila has asked, or a statement that Lila has made. And I think sometimes his laughter is a result of, because she's willing to ask questions, and her life like really brings into sharp relief some really interesting theological questions. And I think that sometimes Ames kind of realizes, her question makes him realize how little he knows, or in some way how insufficient the doctrinal answer is to lived reality. And he finds some sort of kind of absurd humor in that. I think I remember him a couple of times saying to Lila that he says, you ask the most interesting questions, or maybe you always ask the most interesting questions. And there, yeah, I don't, and there's things that what Ames really wants to do, it seems, is think.
Uh-huh.
And this provides him with even more opportunities to think, and which he really appreciates. So and he seems much more interested in the questions than in the answers.
Mhm.
Bowden seems like a preacher who's much more interested in the answers
Right.
than in the questions. So yeah, and then I always get the sense that his laughter is about himself, and
Mhm.
Lila kind of assumes that his laughter is about her.
Yes. Yeah, I think so too. And it's interesting thinking about her lack of education, her lack of exposure to the church, except getting left on church steps and stuff, as a kid, her lack of growing up in a church setting, someone else of her age would not necessarily ask questions like that because of the way we're raised to act and behave in church. Does that make sense? This idea of, it's not certainly in the middle of a sermon. You can't just like raise your hand and ask a question. For some reason, I was just thinking about that yesterday or this morning. I was like, what? It would be complete chaos if like church was like an actual conversation.
Right.
Kind of thing. But my kids would run wild with that if that was a concept. But I think like Lila, like I think other people would have I'm not supposed to question the preacher in that way. But Lila doesn't have that same filter built into her because she wasn't taught it. So she asks questions that do surprise him, and that maybe other people have too, but they don't ask.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that they're questions that Ames has himself.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And yeah, and so because at one point he says something to the effect of like, yeah, I've thought about that before. Like I think about that quite a bit, actually. But yeah, there's something about the I guess that dynamic that both characters find freeing in some way, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Damon, you had mentioned that the idea of offense. And so this is one way we see it. Is this the primary example that you see of people being offended, or are there other ways that you see it happening also?
I think this is the way that these sort of like interpersonal offenses are the things that get labeled most often in the novel as offenses.
Okay.
Like Lila she's offended by people giving her their old clothes. Like she thinks that they're thinking of her as a charity case, as an object, essentially, an object for their charity. And she gets offended by that. She gets offended by Ames' laughter, or that sort of thing. And then there are a whole bunch of other things. They don't necessarily, like the word offense doesn't get connected to them, I don't think, in the writing, but it's certainly implied. Things like Doll stealing a child from the house. As times get worse and worse for the traveling group of workers, they start stealing from folks as well. Doll did something with a knife. I don't know yet what that thing is, but certainly some sort of offense was most likely committed, and maybe it was used in prevention of an offense. I don't know. But and I think part of it, I think the novel sort of wants to ask us, what is an offense, and why do some offenses carry more weight than others, or even do some offenses carry more weight than others? Is Yeah, and then this all gets tied up with this question of salvation also that the novel wants us, I think, to ask. This seems to be like the most really poignantly theological of these three books.
Mhm.
But yeah, this section just kind of made me think about offense. And at one point, Ames is worried about having offended Lila, and he has, but he doesn't really know it. Yeah, I was just thinking about offense. What is that? How does it work?
What is the offense you're thinking of, Damon?
Well, in that, I think Ames is worried that he has said something that Lila took offense to, but I guess I'm not necessarily thinking of a particular one.
Okay.
Just in the, I don't know. I think these sort of small interpersonal offenses, we kind of tend to brush off and think, well, that wasn't really that big of a deal. But they are. I don't know. I don't have like a really bigger point that I'm trying to get to. I was just noticing it.
Okay. You often connect that to Midwestern personality types.
Yeah, for sure. And we offend people without really realizing it. We're also pretty good at offending people while acting like we're not offending them. So being passive aggressive.
Oh, okay.
Midwesterners tend to be really good at being passive aggressive about things. But I think it's also connected to this idea of salvation and what is salvation and how does it work. And this section really, Lila really starts to she's thinking about sort of eternal judgment, and she starts sort of imagining Doll standing before God and being judged. And she really doesn't like that idea. She really doesn't like the idea of really anyone being judged. And then she is concerned about sort of this idea of eternal salvation, that if a person hasn't accepted Christ, then any good deeds that they're going to be deemed to be a sinner and condemned to hell for all time, really almost regardless of what their life is like, or the good deeds that they may have done. And then that raises a question of, well, what if a person never heard of Jesus? Can they still be condemned? And she gets baptized, and then I think that she starts to feel guilty that she would be saved and Doll and Doan and the others wouldn't. And then that question of eternal salvation, to me, also gets contrasted with this idea of salvation must also mean something in the lived world as well. And like Doll herself performed an act of salvation for Lila. She saved her from that house. She saved her life. She baptized her, right? She washed her and cleaned her and said live to her. And then Doll, in Gilead, folks are performing acts of salvation for Doll. They get her housing. They get her clothing. They get her food. They get her money. And she doesn't really like any of it. But it still happened. And so, like, are those still salvific acts, even if the recipient doesn't really want them?
I don't think I had thought about that what's happening for Lila in Gilead is very similar to what Doll did, except, Doll took her out of the situation, whereas she's walked herself into this one. But the acts of service are very similar. But and granted, she was a child and she was ill and didn't really have a say. You know, she couldn't have done anything, I don't think, much different when Doll took her. And I don't know if that's maybe some sort of internal anger at not being given a chance to grow up with the family she was born into. I mean, you know, if she's a grown up and she's completely upset and offended by this, does that mean she's actually upset with what Doll did? Even though that's not the impression I get from how she talks about Doll. The impression I get is that Doll was everything. Doll is still everything. And she would still do just about anything to be with Doll or to make things okay. I don't know. That just strikes me as very interesting.
Mhm.
I think possibly this idea about inside and outside that I keep coming to might play in here, because Doll took her outside and they lived mostly outside. What this charity is doing in Gilead is bringing her inside a civilized world where she doesn't feel as free or wild. She keeps mentioning appreciating wildness when she's outside. She wants, you know, all those outdoor experiences, and she's lonely when she's indoors. Lonely when she's inside civilization.
She doesn't seem to trust being indoors either. I think this is the section where, doesn't it say something like she locks the door if Ames is not home? If he's home, it's okay. But as soon as he leaves, she like feels the need to protect herself.
Well, she locks the door and then she gets in a corner and draws her knees up until she's too pregnant to do that. But this is very much like hiding under the table at the house she occupied with the itinerant people who were, you know, not necessarily nurturing to her.
Right.
Yeah, Jenny, you were talking about Lila, and I wonder if part of Lila's question about salvation or has to do with why should, this is what how I wrote it, why should anyone even need to be saved? Right? Why should a child even find themselves in a place where they're close to starvation and to death? Why should anyone find themselves in that sort of like a physical need of salvation in some way, shape, or form? Like, why should there be any haves and have-nots?
Right. Any circumstances that are so dire that such acts would be necessary.
Yeah. And thinking about that both in terms of like our physical realm, but also in terms of like we can think of haves and have-nots in terms of poverty, in terms of housing, in terms of whatever else. And we can also think of haves and have-nots in terms of faith. And why should there be anyone who is condemned and not saved? I wonder if that's part of the resentment, maybe in some ways as well.
And she poses that question or something like that question to Ames, right?
Right. She talks about a baby being thrown out into a field. Again, that Ezekiel image. And she tags the baby she, and she, so she's thinking of herself, I think. And why would God let that happen?
Right.
To a child? And people, of course, always ask that question, why does God let people suffer? And I think Ames keeps maintaining he doesn't know everything, but he believes that God is gracious and loving. And he believes that God shared poverty, suffering, and death with human beings. And so that lends a certain dignity to all of those states. And yet, paradoxically, our earthly movement is to alleviate poverty, suffering, and death when we can.
Yeah. And Ames wants to try really hard to refrain from placing any judgment on anyone for any reason. That's not a thing that he wants to do.
Yeah, he says he prays for Doll, even though it's not in his tradition to pray for the dead.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then this is why I think that Ames is, these are all questions that Ames has had, and but don't necessarily always preach that well. the questions, sometimes they do.
Well, it makes sense though that Ames would have these questions, because if you look at what happened with his first wife and child, I mean, I think maybe even he says that I'm no stranger to suffering kind of thing. You know, he's experienced great heartbreak and loss. And so I'm right for Lila to sort of poke that wound a little bit and be like, yeah, I have questioned those same things. And I can't speak from the perspective of a pastor, but this is something that he's supposed to be leading people through, but I don't know if it's uncomfortable for him to have those questions, or to know that he's also had those questions, even though I think they're probably pretty common human existence type things to wonder about at times.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of this is kind of about like what's expected from the role of the pastor, and sometimes what's expected is answers, and sometimes what's expected is questions. And for folks to enter into these sorts of questions and conversations with one another, I think that I hope honestly that everybody asks these questions and thinks about these things. I know that I have, and you sort of.
Uh-oh, we lost your voice.
Oh no.
Now you're back.
Now you're back. You're going to say something?
Well, I'm trying. Am I saying?
Okay. We hear you.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I bumped a chord.
I'll try not. Don't do that.
I'll try not to do that. Maybe I was predestined to bump the chord. I don't know.
Something cut you out there. But the role thing is really interesting, because I think one of the roles Lila is struggling with is the role of the preacher's wife. I mean, that's another sore point for her, is like, she feels very, I'm going to use the word sensitive again, in terms of, does she fit that role? What do the people think of her? She seems to think she doesn't fit that mold. And I think she's like waiting for the other shoe to drop from the townspeople.
Yeah, for sure. She like thinks that this is absurd.
She doesn't want to be looked at.
Yeah.
She doesn't want people to know about her. They're all habits that she's had for a long time, and then to be thrown into a different world.
Well, and a public role in a sense. I mean, especially in a small town, and to be what is Ames, a reverend's wife. I mean, it's a thing, and it's not private, which she very much just wants to be out in her shack again, just moving into town was tough.
Yeah, at some point she kind of hints around that she's a little worried about essentially what others will think, and also like how it would affect Ames. And he says something to the effect of, well, they're not going to fire me. I've been around too long. My family's been around too long to get fired. So it'll be all right.
For some reason, something we were just talking about reminded me of something we didn't mention before we started recording, but there's a lot in this section about Lila wanting to leave.
Yes.
And you know, this idea of like what's going on in Lila's mind has been very surprising to me throughout the whole book, but I found myself again being surprised by how much she's thinking about bolting. And you know, like after the baby comes, is she going to leave? Is she, you know, I think she feels safe and like she can stay through the pregnancy. No one's going to kick her out while she's pregnant, kind of thing. Just like, you know, Ames was like, well, no one's going to fire me. She's like, okay, Ames isn't going to get rid of me. The town can't get rid of me while I'm expecting a baby. But there's also, I have in my notes that there's a recognition by Ames where he even says something to her about not leaving.
Mm-hmm.
You should stay here until the baby comes. After that, of course, you can do whatever you think is best. And I was like, did she vocalize that? Did I miss that? How did he even realize? Does he just see the skittishness in her? I think it's very hard for her to, which Constance, to your point about being in this transient life that she's always lived, it's just so foreign of a concept to her to live in one place and to settle.
Mm-hmm. And she sees value in that former life, you know, to be in touch with nature, be out in the wild, make those sort of, you know, create a family on the road. And I don't know whether here or later she thinks she wants to expose the baby to that. She doesn't want the baby to miss that experience. But it is still this, well, he's not going to love me anymore. The town's not going to accept me. And, you know, I'm going to wake up and be kicked out. So I might as well have my shoes on and ready to go.
Yeah.
It's an insecurity, but I mean, it's driven from insecurity, but also from kind of a longing for that life in a way.
Yeah. Well, that life kept her alive.
Mm-hmm.
That life provided her family. So there is value in it for sure.
I mean, she values herself because she's a woman who knows how to work.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, Jenny, you were
you bumped your cord again, Damon. We can't hear you.
try that one. Is that one working?
There you go. Yep.
Well, hopefully that'll stay. Jenny, you were, before we started, one of the things that you noticed from this section of things was refrains of things, Ames' laughter coming up time and time again, and this refrain of "it don't matter."
Doll says it all the time, but it's become ingrained in Lila's brain and her standard phrases, because we start to hear it from her too. I mean, I haven't underlined every single instance of it, but that would be a fascinating thing to search through the book and count up, because it is all over the place. This idea of it don't matter, it don't matter, it don't matter. And there is a spot I did mark on page 112 where Lila questions that. And I don't know that it is the first instance where she's questioning Doll, but it definitely like jumped out at me as I was reading that, oh, that's interesting that she's questioning this mantra, this refrain from her childhood. This is the top of page 112. It says, how could it be that none of it mattered? It was most of what happened, but if it did matter, how could the world go on the way it did when there were so many people living the same and worse? And then later at the paragraph, it says, the quiet of the world was terrible to her, like mockery. She had hoped to put an end to these thoughts, but they returned to her and she returned to them, which I think is a lot of that like looping that we're seeing throughout the book, both in the way she's thinking about the past, talking about the past, her thoughts. It's like she's trying to get away from these, I don't know if I would call them dark and twisty thoughts, but just this like, I'm not sure how to word that, but this idea of, I'm curious to know both of your thoughts on it don't matter. What doesn't matter? And is that just a way to say like, suck it up and carry on? I don't know what purpose I suppose it probably serves a lot of different purposes for different people throughout the book.
Yeah. I think it's partly related to that idea of don't expect things, don't wish for things, and then you won't be disappointed when they don't happen. And that has a lot to do with Lila's not wishing for this relationship with Ames to pan out, or her hesitancy at counting on it. And she'll reiterate it in the words "never mind," too.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Constance. No, go ahead.
I was just wondering, I'm kind of looking toward the end of the novel and some resolution to these tensions, and I wonder if some of the things don't matter.
Yeah, I think at times it's related to it sort of becomes a way to shrug off some sort of a disappointment in some ways. And I think it's this paragraph in particular is really her question is about existence. She says it's at some point to maybe to Bowden and to Ames. What is existence and what does it mean? And surely it must mean something because that's all that there is.
That line occurs right after their whole band breaks up because Doan is mauled by a dog and arrested for stealing, and everybody has to go their own way.
That's right. So it's just Lila and Doll, it says. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, I think also because like if nothing matters, right? Like the same person who is saying it don't matter is the same person who risked their safety and well-being to save a child. So that must have mattered,
right,
to do that. And yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that some more.
Well, and to the point of not how we learn about people in an unfolding sort of way, I feel like we learned some important things about Doll in this section. The fact that, and maybe we knew this before, but that like Doll's not her name, but Lila never knew her name, and that was in part like protection for everybody. And then also, I don't remember prior to this about the description of her face. And the distinctive markings on her face that also make it very difficult for them to stay put in one place because Doll stands out. Right. And so those those are kind of big details. That also helps us understand why they stayed on the move as often as they did, because they had to, so that there couldn't be retribution or prosecution for Doll taking Lila, though, as we keep saying, like, is it really, like, if she was going to die, was it wrong that she took the baby because the child was not doing well, probably wasn't going to make it? I don't know.
Yeah, but how would that stand out in a court?
Right.
It's really different when you look at somebody's motive. Her motive was to save, not to deprive somebody else of a child.
Right.
But to them, they've been deprived of a child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which gets back, to this question of offense. What is an offense and what isn't, and who gets to define it? And when, I oftentimes find myself forgetting that they would have been fugitives.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That from another perspective, this was a kidnapping.
Right.
That took place.
That doesn't go over real well with the law.
No, and it's interesting to think that that from one perspective, this is an act of grace and mercy, and from the other perspective, this is a terrible and grievous injustice that has been done.
Yeah, so I mean, the novel questions whose judgment we rely on, and does God have that kind of merciful judgment that we would wish for?
Yeah, and Ames kind of seems to say, well, I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a mystery nonetheless. Yeah, we're about at the time where we should probably start wrapping up for our conversation. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about Lila's almost first marriage, and what that was and what that might have looked like. We didn't talk about baptism. We talked about it kind of, but in this section that Lila asks Ames, like, can you wash off a baptism? She said.
And she tries to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. After she tries to wash it off, then she asks him, is this a thing you can wash off? And he said, no, you don't have to worry about that. But you also kind of get the impression that she wouldn't really mind if it was washed off.
Yeah, that's definitely an instance of Ames not understanding what she's asking. Like, he's hearing it as, can I do something so bad that it washes away? Or almost like a child, like, if I take a bath, does it go away? Kind of question. But I don't think that's what she's asking. She is like, can I give it back? Can I say no thank you now and take it back?
Yeah, it's another, like, how locked into this thing am I?
Which clearly she is not okay with that. You're seeing that all over.
Commitment is tough.
Yes, it is.
When if I'm recalling correctly, part of her question about that also springs from her, like, growing realization that at least Bowden and maybe Ames would think that all of the people that she used to know. Oh, someone's getting a phone call.
Sorry.
But that they would think that all of the people that she used to know are condemned for all time. And I think then part of her question is, well, if that's God, then I might not want to be a part of this.
I laughed a little bit, and Constance, then at the notes that you added, Lila's dislike of Bowden is very clear here early on in this section, and yet she's married by him, right? Doesn't he conduct their wedding in his parlor with his family? Which is our first almost mention of Jack, I think. But she doesn't like Bowden. And then Constance, I laughed when you, what you were added to the notes, which was something about how you're like, yeah, I don't like him either, Lila. And
Well, I think Lila's a pretty straight shooter, so I felt, okay, Lila, we're on the same team here. I don't like Bowden.
Yeah.
Well, I can't say I don't like Bowden, but I don't trust him.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and there's a lot
Mhm.
going on, a lot that we could discuss. I like sort of wrapping this up maybe this way, maybe give us a little something. I think Jenny, you and I are reading through this for the first time. So but Constance, you can join in as well, just as we move forward for the rest of the novel, for the rest of our conversations, just something that you are looking forward to, or something that just I'd like to think about this thing a little bit more as we move ahead.
I think for me, because we know Lila stays, right? I mean, we know that from Gilead, from the first book. We know Lila stays, or at least comes back. If she leaves, she comes back. I don't know what's in the middle there, but I'm curious. I think finishing the second half, maybe we're half-ish through of the book, that what gets her to stay, because this is so counterintuitive to her life to stay and to settle. I'm wondering what does that for her.
Mhm.
Yeah. Constance?
I'm looking for reconciliations between the the sort of in and out, the religious questions. I'm wondering how they'll all be answered in the end, what conclusions they'll come to that allow them to stay together.
Yeah. I would be surprised if they come to any actual conclusions.
Well, right, but
Um,
something a little clearer, I'm hoping for.
yeah. Some sort of place. Well, we can meet here on this question, or whatever the case may be. Let's see. At the end of our last conversation, I talked about I was curious to see what this wedding looked like. And then like the next page that I read, that's where the wedding was. And now I think maybe one of the things that I'm curious about is the pregnancy and the birth, and then also that infant stands to be baptized at some point. And what might Lila think about now a baptism for her own offspring, and what sorts of questions that might raise for her. In Gilead, weren't they out like baptizing cats when they were little kids? Wasn't that?
Yes.
The deal? So those are the things that we have pondered over, been confused about. So happy to have dialogue partners for it, and some of the things that we are looking forward. So we'll wrap up from there, and the reading and the conversation will continue. So thank you, Constance. Thank you, Jenny, for joining us.
Delightful to talk with you. I love this book, by the way.
And with all those things said and done, until next time, toodaloo.